history of their congregation or Philadelphia. Today, Carol has lined up a great group of folks who have actually made use of these records or are planning to make use of these records so that we can hear real life stories about how these records are meaningful in a larger sense and how they're being used. So Carol, I want to turn it over to you and let you lead the show forward.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thanks to all of you for showing up and joining us again. So we thought today we would focus on how people use the records. I think it's pretty clear how genealogists use these records and how thrilled they are with them. But historians and scholars use them as well. And I just wanted to open by reading some of the remarks of Julie Winch, who is a professor of history at UMass in Boston, from her letter of recommendation for the project. And Julie wrote, these are just a few extracts from her work. The linkages among congregations promise so much and reveal so much about the diversity of the population of what was once the nation's capital. Religious lines were so permeable. People had ties of one sort or another far beyond their own institutions. In my own work, which drew in large part on the sacramental records and vestry minutes of St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church, I found I often needed to venture into the records of Christ Church, St. George's, St. Peter's, and Gloria Dei. Before the founding of St. Thomas's, and in some instances when they were enslaved and had limited control over their spiritual lives, African and African American people in Philadelphia were often baptized or married in one or other of the predominantly white Episcopalian churches. Members of those churches continued to interact with members of St. Thomas's. Communicants of St. Thomas's sometimes drifted away to the Presbyterian or Baptist folds, and records of their lives surfaced in unexpected places. Especially in times of crisis, notably the yellow fever epidemics which beset the city in the 1790s and early 1800s, the members of Mikveh Israel joined with the members of the various Christian churches to coordinate relief. In short, congregations enriched one another in both spiritual and secular ways, and that is one of the aspects of life in the colonial, revolutionary, and later eras that this project will bring to the fore. It will also save many a researcher the painstaking task of trying to verify which records are where, and ease the nagging doubt that something has been somehow overlooked in the research process. And that's certainly one of the goals that we hope this project will bring, that we will find the ties that led these various 18th and 19th century Philadelphians to travel or support one congregation or the other or multiples at the same time. We know that Benjamin Franklin, for example, rented a pew at Christ Church, but we also know that he contributed to the rebuilding of the synagogue at Mikveh Israel in the 1780s after the fire. And Gloria Dei has a lightning rod that he installed in their steeple. So this was not uncommon, and obviously Julie's work has shown that, and our own anecdotal evidence shows that as well. But today I've asked Bill Quigley and Libby Brown to talk about their use of these types of records in this in their own research. So Bill Quigley is going to lead us off, and Bill is a member of the history department at the Governor's Academy, which is the nation's oldest non-sectarian independent boarding school founded in 1763. At various times there, Bill has served as head of the history department, dean of academics, and dean of faculty, assistant head of school. He's the founding director of the Academy's Writing Center. Bill's own work, Pure Heart, The Faith of a Father and Son in the War for a More Perfect Union, tells the story of the Reverend Benjamin Dorr, rector of Christ Church, and his son, Captain William Dorr, who served in General Meade's army and was killed at the Battle of Spotsylvania. Bill drew heavily upon the Reverend Dorr's sermons that Jean Craig mentioned last week to better understand how Dorr kept his fractured congregation together during these difficult years. And so now, Bill, can we hear more about your work?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carol, for that generous introduction and for inviting me to participate in today's session. Good morning, folks. I want to underscore as well, in agreement with what's been said already by Carol and Beth, that the work you're volunteering to do, as I understand it, transcribing these historical documents, as well as scanning or photographing them, right, for the World Wide Web, it is a boon of immeasurable value. When those materials are made available digitally to anyone in the world, now and in the future, we can't possibly foretell all that might come of it. But I can surely say, as an historian and as a high school teacher of history, that you're not just facilitating, you are enabling students and scholars to make historical discoveries that they would not otherwise make, at least not as readily as we're doing more and more these days from our keyboards right at home. The digitation of archival materials is a godsend, especially now as libraries and historical societies and archives have had to close because of COVID-19. I am researching now another book. It's another Civil War history that took place in Pennsylvania, the so-called Christiana Riot of 1851, more accurately called the Christiana Resistance to the wrongful and terribly divisive Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. In June 2019, I spent 5 days researching at and around the site of that deadly resistance in Lancaster County. COVID prevents me from making other research trips now. My plans to peruse materials in the Huntington Library in California later this fall are scuttled now. Though I am finding that some primary source material, such as newspaper coverage of the event, is available online. That said, I love exploring archives, and I can't wait to be able to resume that adventure. I stumbled on the Doors' heroism in the archives of the independent secondary school where I teach. In all of my research, I have failed to determine the provenance of the Door papers that are in our school's archives. They were likely donated by a Door descendant with some tie to this academy, someone whose surname was probably other than Door. Benjamin Door was born and raised hardly more than 5 miles from here. I'm going to share my screen now and show you some of that collection. Can you see those?
Yes, they
Good.
look great.
So the collection that we have includes 20 of 194 letters that Door's son, William, wrote to him from the field while he was serving as an officer in the Union Army's 121st Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment. It includes also sketches by Will and by a good friend of his who had volunteered with him. And it includes miscellaneous other materials, such as insignia discs for the 1st Corps and the 5th Corps in which Will's regiment served, blue for the 1st Corps and red for the 5th Corps. It's got newspaper clippings. It has leaflets that were used in association with the dedication of the memorial to Captain William White Door in Christchurch. And these were all part of a larger memorial scrapbook that Benjamin Door compiled and kept. The greater part of Will's wartime letters to his father, 170 of them, they're missing, and I've not found those. These dried sprigs of boxwood and wildflowers that Will tucked into some letters, preserved now in sepia tones, something of the young soldier's refined sensibilities, his romanticism, as well as the love between he and his father. There he is on the left and Benjamin Door on the right. I suspect that all of you, like me, find an extra thrill, a tingle that we don't quite feel in finding a transcription or even a digital facsimile of an historical document, as we do when we hold in our gloved hands the original document. or in leafing through archival file boxes when we find the document we're looking for, or we discover there something new and important to our subject. I'll unshare my screen here. Still now, 18 years later, I recall my excitement in learning that the Christ Church Preservation Trust held all of Benjamin Doerr's handwritten sermons, hundreds of them. How thrilled I was to wind down the spiral staircase from Carol's office to the basement archives and see them all filed and shelved in boxes. On one of those trips, I brought my youngest daughter with me. She was then in the 6th grade, and she and I shared the thrill of touching a snippet of Bishop William White's hair and examining Benjamin Doerr's walking stick. Annie spent some happy hours with me. While I was doing my research, she was researching and deciphering the words and the Greek letters and the symbols that were carved into Doerr's cane. And I treasure still her notes. I have those. I spent a fair amount of time in the Christ Church archives, traveling from Eastern Massachusetts to Philadelphia 3 or 4 times over several years. But even so, I didn't have enough time or money to stay there and read Doerr's sermons closely, analytically. On my first visit, and that was in the summer of 2002, Carol and her staff generously took a dozen or so sermons that I had selected to be photocopied at a nearby office store so that I could take those sermons home with me. On another visit, when the Preservation Trust then had a digital scanner, I scanned tens more sermons. Carol was then able to upload that selection of Doerr's sermons to the church's website, and I again could then study them more closely at home. Jean Craig delivered an excellent presentation last week on Doerr's sermon on the National Day of Fasting and Prayer in mournful observation or observance of Lincoln's assassination. Doerr typically recycled his sermons, and he meticulously recorded on the backs of the first pages, if I recall correctly, the different dates and places that he gave each of his sermons. As Jean noted, it is fascinating to see the revisions he made to a sermon to fit a different occasion. In his penciled insertions, amendments, and crossouts, we can nearly read Doerr's mind at work. Having read in Deborah Goff's excellent History of Christ Church that Doerr never preached on slavery or secession, one of my most thrilling and important discoveries was that he had indeed preached on both of those subjects, even as his congregation divided fiercely over those contentious issues. He barely veiled his preaching on them in biblical allusions and parables. I believe he did that because he hoped to change the hearts and minds of leading Copperhead Democrats in his church by speaking to them through the Christian faith they held in common. Even Scripture, though, was and is now still apprehended differently by faithful people. And many American Christians then invoke the Bible to defend racial slavery. Doerr's sermon on the day of national fasting and prayer in the wake of Lincoln's killing is exceptional in that he drops the biblically elusive veil and he speaks more directly, perhaps because the Union had then in June of 1865 quelled the rebellion, and perhaps because he needed to convince himself as much as his congregation of hopefulness in the Union's victory, despite his and many of his congregants' grief over Lincoln's killing. With the US presidential election just 40 days from now, I feel compelled, almost obliged, to recall with you Benjamin Doerr's sermon on Thanksgiving Day, 1864, addressing the results of the presidential election just days before. Many historians, John Meacham, Ronald White, Jill Lepore, Joseph Ellis, and Douglas Brinkley, among others, advise us that the outcome of this election in November, will be as significant to the future of our nation, if not also the world, as only two past presidential elections. That of 1864, when Lincoln was challenged by General George McClellan, a pro-slavery Democrat who would have brokered a truce with the slaveholding Confederacy. And the election of 1876, which was a tawdry, fraud-filled affair by both parties that resulted in a despicable political deal. The Democrats, particularly Southern Democrats, accepted the presidency of Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in return for the US government's abandoned enforcement of equal rights for Black Americans. That compromise resulted in 100 more years of legalized racial discrimination and segregation in America. Many Republicans back then, in 1864, nearly abandoned hope that Lincoln could win re-election. Polls indicated swelling support for General McClellan, a rising tide of weariness among Northerners who had suffered dreadful losses for a cause that had expanded from preserving the Union to a corollary that many Northerners supported uncertainly or not at all: emancipation of some 4 million Black slaves. Some in Lincoln's party advised him to suspend the election, but he would not have none of that. The whole purpose of the war, he said, was that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The American people, he said, must decide whether those two causes justified their continued sacrifices for them. Lincoln even more bravely, while defending the whole aspirational project of America with the sword, Lincoln even more bravely put it to a vote. Union soldiers in the field were encouraged to vote by mail, even though they seemed likely to favor their beloved former commander, General McClellan, who promised to negotiate an immediate end to the grievous war. But no, 78% of those soldiers voted for Lincoln, knowing full well they voted to fight on at the peril of their lives. And Northerners re-elected Lincoln in a massive landslide. And this is what Dorr said about all of this, the people's electoral choice and its significance. And remember that his congregation included Pennsylvania's leading anti-war, anti-emancipation Democrats. I'm just going to read a little bit from my book. Dorr praised Lincoln's Thanksgiving proclamations of thanks to God for, quote, many and signal victories over the enemy who is of our household, for his increase of our free population by emancipation and immigration, and for his goodness to animate and inspire our minds and hearts with fortitude, courage, and resolution sufficient for the great trial of civil war, into which we have been brought by our adherence as a nation to the cause of freedom and humanity. For his sermon that Thanksgiving Day, Dorr chose a text from Deuteronomy about, quote, God's special covenant with his chosen people after delivering them from their oppressive bondage in Egypt, conducting them safely through the waste, howling wilderness, and bringing them to the borders of the promised land. Dorr reviewed the blessings that God had promised to the people he had appointed Moses to lead from bondage. Those promises, brethren, are not peculiar to the Jews, he said. They are as much ours as theirs. They are the covenant which God makes with every Christian nation upon earth. In contrast, though, to spiritual and political hubris commonly served that Thanksgiving from pulpits across the North, Dorr praised the humility and mercy with which Lincoln concluded his Thanksgiving proclamation, and he declaimed the president's words. I do therefore recommend to my fellow citizens that they do reverently humble themselves in the dust, and from thence offer up penitent and fervent prayers and supplications to the great disposer of events for a return of the inestimable blessings of peace, union, and harmony throughout the land. These are words, the rector declared, of truth and soberness. They point to the whole source of true greatness, humility in God's sight. For their nation to be worthy of God's continued blessing, he admonished his congregants they would have to act more humbly in imitation of the Son of Man, unquote. And I'll just end there. So, great work that you folks are doing. Thank you. As one of many people, both as a teacher who tries to make this kind of material available to students and an historian myself, I can assure you that I'm very, very, I am very grateful.
Bill, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll have some time for questions that people can submit through the chat button, and we'll discuss them towards the end. But now let's hear from Libby Brown, whom is not unfamiliar to many of you, I suspect. Libby is the co-author of St. Peter's Church, Faith in Action for 250 Years. She was the co-founder of the historic St. Peter's Preservation Corporation, founder of St. Peter's Guides, former chair of the St. Peter's History Committee, and she is a present member of the Episcopal Diocesan History Committee. She now gives PowerPoint lectures at Cathedral Village, mostly on Philadelphia history. So let me turn it over to Libby. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and it's great to be with you all today. I have been so thrilled by this project because I've spent so much time working on the history of St. Peter's, probably over like 40 years or so. And let me tell you a little bit about what this project has meant to me in my hunting around to understand St. Peter's history. So let's see, share screen. Here I am. Okay, so here is the book that I wrote the early section of St. Peter's history for, and this was done for the 250th anniversary of the church, which took place in 2011, although we started working on it in 2007 because that was when the church first acquired the land for the church to be built on, and so it is kind of the summation of the work I had done over probably in the it feels like it, the 1990s, 1980s and the 1990s, because of my fascination with this building, which is basically unchanged since it opened in 1761. And as many of you know, it was part of Christ Church from the beginning. It was called the United Churches of Christ Church in St. Peter's until 1832. So I covered that period of the church history. And then Cordelia Biddle and Alan Heavens did the later sections. So during this time, I'm digging around in the St. Peter's archives, which I guess was in the 1990s. Blessedly, Carol Smith and some other people came in and organized and made things safe and properly stored. So it was a thrill to have that happen. But even before then, I was sort of digging through boxes and finding old registers, and But you know, there was all the stuff which was, you know, precious to handle. And one of the first things I found was the deed to the land from the sons of William Penn for the church to be built on. And you know, this deed was in there, and you can see on this slide the condition of the seal and whatever that is that was hanging off of it, and I could read bits and snatches of it, but it was pretty tough. So when Carolyn Klepser, a good friend from the St. Peter's congregation and the history committee, and my successor as head of the guides, actually transcribed it for this project, here it was. And this is just the beginning of the text, and you may or may not want to read all of that, but it names the people who were involved, sort of down in the middle: Atwood Shute, William Plumstead, John Wilcox, Jacob Duché, and Thomas Penrose, who were pressuring the Christ Church rector to build a new church. And finally, I guess they persuaded the Penns to give some land, and that's a whole other story. You have to read the book to learn all about how it all transpired. But it was just so great to be able to have this online, sitting here at my computer and finding the not only the image but then the wording in the deed. And then another thing that I had been doing all along was, well, when I was writing the book, or even before that, I came across in the baptismal registers the copy that was made of the joint United Churches register. There was just one register, and when the churches separated, somebody made a copy of of all the registers. So I was looking at the baptismal one and saw something about the baptizing of some enslaved people in Philadelphia. And I'm like, what? So this was pretty amazing. And so I came across, and then so this year, when I was doing a PowerPoint for the St. Peter's Sages group just a month or so ago, I wanted to get that list, but of course I couldn't go into the archives, and lo and behold, I found it, and this is the original Christ Church one. And I don't know if you can read in this listing, but starting here. Now, this is October 31st of 1766. You have Oliver Francis, Negro slave of Governor Hamilton's, age 63 years. Susanna Jennings, formerly Mr. Penn's Negro, age 79. I guess it's Sabrina, wife of Oliver, Mr. Hockley's Negro, age 50. Dinah, sister to Sabina. And then November 1st, Ann Pounder, Governor Penn's Negro. Harriet, a free Negro. John Richmond, son of Jacob and Harriet, Negroes. Elizabeth Richmond, daughter. And then it goes on to everybody else. So there it is, the Penns, the Governor Hamilton, who was, the Penns governor while they weren't in town, and Hockley, who was involved with the Penns. And then, so I'm like, all right, this is absolute evidence of the slavery that is happening in Philadelphia in the 18th century, that people tend not to know about or ignore. And so here it is in writing. But then this raises a huge question. Why were these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people being baptized on one day and then the next? What was happening? Why? So this, you know, when you can go into these archives, it not only gives you evidence, but it raises more questions about our history as we dig deeper and deeper into the history of the enslavement of people in Philadelphia. So here you have that baptismal register, and then these people. So looking more, and while I was looking for this in the register, because I knew I had seen it, you know, in the copy at St. Peter's, but I couldn't remember exactly which year it was. So I'm going through and through and through, and I found something else which amazed me. And here's baptismal register for 1765. And I look here and I can see the baptism of Dr. John Morgan, baptized in London by Reverend Mr. Peters, who was the assistant rector at Christ Church. And then that's February 17th, 1765. And then a week later, Samuel Powell, Esquire, baptized in London by the Reverend Mr. Peters. So what's this all about? Okay, so you know, anybody who goes to Christ Church or St. Peter's knows that Samuel Powell was a member. And anybody in the medical field knows about Dr. John Morgan, who was a doctor in Philadelphia and started what is now the Penn Medical School in this period. So what were they doing in London in 1765? Well, Morgan was studying at the University of Edinburgh. Samuel Powell was in the midst, or maybe the end, of his grand tour of Europe, which took him all over Europe over the course of 7 years. Not bad, huh? And so why were they getting baptized in London? You know, I mean, well, in London, that would be the reason why, but why were they getting baptized? And for years, I've, you know, read or heard or surmised a lot about the fact that the Quakers really ran Philadelphia until kind of the middle of the 18th century. And that by then the Anglicans had really taken over. And what it looks like is that it wasn't that the Quaker people there were more Anglicans suddenly than Quakers. It was that Quakers were becoming Anglicans. Because if you're a Quaker, you can't show off your wealth in your house or your dress or your carriage, and by going to a Quaker meeting. But if you're an Anglican, you can do those things. And if you look at the interior of St. Peter's Church, which I don't know if all of you have been into, but it has a fabulous ornate pulpit at the west end of the church, and a fabulous ornate organ case at the east end of the church. And if you take those two away, you are left what is basically a plain Quaker meeting house. And George Thomas, the historian, Philadelphia historian, has commented that Robert Smith, who designed St. Peter's, was probably trying to make those lapsed Quakers feel better. And so many Quakers were becoming Anglicans, including John Morgan and Samuel Powell. So here's the proof in these archives, which, if it weren't for this digitization project, I would never have known. So thank you. So anyways, these are just a couple of examples of a few examples of what these transcriptions have done for us, and it shows you how important and valuable it is to have these precious documents of our past in a form that we can read today, especially today, so that we can pass on our history to future scholars and congregation members. So thank you so much, all of you. And if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
And thank you, Libby. So if anyone has questions, please just put them in the chat, or I guess, Tess, and Beth, we can probably raise hands, although I'm not as sure how that function's working here. Chat, we know how to handle, and we'll do our best to answer them. We also wanted to show you a way of navigating our website so that you can see some of the prior presentations that had been given. So I think, Carly, have you pulled up our website so that people can see some of those prior talks?
Yes. Let me share my screen so I can show those to you.
So this would be on our news and updates page. And you can see different presentations that we have done in the past, thanks to the generosity of the Athenaeum for hosting them. And I think what Carly has pulled up for us right now is last year's symposium with Jim Duffin's remarks on how he's used church records to untangle the property records. And Dr. Ann Norton Green, who worked with the diocesan history minutes to determine how the church changed over time. And then Jubilee Marshall, who was a senior at Villanova University, did a wonderful short presentation on investigating Black burials through the church records. And finally, Jean Wolfe showed us her work on finding vital crumbs that lead researchers down new paths for data. So you can look at some of the slides. I don't know that we have Jim's slides up, but everybody else's slides are there, and you can hear the audio recording of their talk as well. And then Bill Quigley's talk at Christ Church Bill, was it just last September? It seems like another lifetime, on where we commemorated the 150th anniversary of the death of Benjamin Dorr, was also included. Here we go. So this is here, and it's a wonderful talk as well. So please feel free to go through this and see it all. The address is philadelphiacongregations.org, and I'm sure we'll put it in the chat for you as well.
Okay, and that's in the chat now. So if anyone wants to explore it, they can.
And under news and you just go to the news and events and scroll down that page, and you'll find those different talks. Now, I don't know if any of you are newcomers to this session. Would you like us to review the website again and how to navigate it? Would that be useful for folks?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Carly, can you go back to the website then? And back to the home page, I guess, and we'll start from there. So there's the website. It's philadelphiacongregations.org. And as you can see here, you can browse through items by congregation or by item. So in that little search bar above, you can type minutes, and everybody's vestry minutes are likely to be popping up. You can also, if you're specifically interested in a congregation's records, go to the Browse by Congregation tab, and that will take you to the various individual churches. And then Carly, just like pick up like the Mikveh Israel records, like browse items. So once you're here, this will then take you to the various different records that are online for Mikveh Israel. And you can go through and see all of those. And when you click on a particular one, it will pull up that particular ledger with all of the scanned pages that Mike Seneca did such a fabulous job on. and go through it. Now, nothing has been transcribed in this particular one, so if anyone is interested in accounting records from Mikveh Israel, it's all yours. So Carly, let's go back to the site and we'll show people how they can get started with transcribing. So here you're going to go to the Help Transcribe tab, and we have Getting Started with Transcribing. And Carly, do you want to pick this up since you did that nice audio? Carly also has a nice little video you can listen to if that's your learning style and you would like that, you're more comfortable with that. But here it is in text.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go about this a little bit of a different way because I'm a little bit of a visual learner. I think it's not that self-explanatory from necessarily this site, or this portion of the site. But what I would recommend doing is, one, you want to find a resource. So, but before that, you'll click on, I'm going to click on African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Just going to click on any item. See the Pew Rentals, 1818 to 1840. And it looks like nothing has been transcribed here. So what I'm going to do is click on Help Transcribe this resource. And it looks like I'm already logged in, but let me log out. So, oh, sorry about this. Some things don't always work out. Okay. Okay, so this is the page that will show up when you click on Help Transcribe this resource, and you'll want to log in or register. So if you've already created a login, you'll log in here. But if you haven't, you'll log in here, and you should get an email saying you've logged in and whatnot. And then you should be able to begin transcribing what you've chosen to transcribe. And I'm just going to show you what that's going to look like. Of course. Okay. I know some of you have seen this screen before, but for those of you who have not, you'll see down here, once it loads, you can click on Edit, the front cover. It looks like here, I'm going to make this screen a little bit bigger. There's nothing on the front cover. And for that, there's specific rules you would follow. And that's where the transcription guidelines are important. So here's basically the rules for transcribing. And I did see one question that I want to address, but it's important to know at least where the guidelines are to transcribe. So if you run into a question, this is the first place you would go. Otherwise, please do email me or Carol. We will answer your question. Okay, and then let's see, oops. I want to address this question that I saw in the chat earlier. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so there was a question about margins in transcriptions. I think you might be talking about documents with columns. Silva, was that right? I don't know if...
No, I meant the margins at the sides and the front. You know, when I don't know what the margins of that page look like, so I went 3 spaces in and started a margin there, and I don't know if that's correct or not.
Trying to answer that question. I think the best
We'll
thing
get back to you, but my sense is
Yeah.
we are not using margins. Alan, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. I think you're just going to go in and you're using the space bar when you're trying to create columns and things of that nature. But for everything else, just start at the beginning.
I think that's correct. The editor that's built into the website will determine the margins. There's also another thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing transcriptions, and that is not to use the tab character. The editor there does not recognize tabs. If you have to do alignments of various columns, you need to push them apart using multiple space characters, but no tab characters.
And then we have a question here from James Hill saying, when DR period is clearly debit, not doctor, should it also be transcribed as DR period in an editor's note debit? You can. I don't think you have to do that on every page. Alan, what's your thought on that?
The editor's note tag, and of course, if you're not familiar with the tags, you want to take a look at that section under the style sheet that we have online. But the editor's note tag is kind of a catch-all tag that will allow you to enter any kind of explanation you want without mixing it up in the transcription of the original document. So if you need to know how to create an editor's tag, look at that set of instructions online. It will tell you about the editor's tag, the editor's note tag, and all the other tags too. There's a whole family of them.
We encourage questions. You're welcome to email me. And I know, James Hill, I'm noticing that you said you emailed yesterday, and I don't know who you emailed, but you're welcome to email me or Carly or Alan. If we don't know the answer, we'll pass it on to Walt, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. So the prioritization of items and/or congregations in which to proceed. Ideally, we would be transcribing the registers, the listing of members, so the burials, the baptisms, the marriages, because that's what we kind of promised CLIR we would focus upon. But this is your pandemic project, and I don't want to impose any guidelines on you. If you find that you would rather be transcribing the trustees' minutes or the Society of Friends records, feel free, and anything that is done just enhances our understanding. So we're just very grateful to you for making that possible. Alan, I'm seeing special characters such as ampersand and dittos. Use them as they appear. That's in the transcription guidelines as well, is it not?
It is, and the basic advice, and I think it applies to characters like the ampersand and double quote characters, is you transcribe them just exactly as they appear in the original document. We want to try to keep the transcriptions as close to the original document as we possibly can.
And I should mention that we are running bi-weekly coffee hours for our transcribers. So anyone who has been involved in this for a while, it's every other Tuesday at 11, and we get together. It's very informal. We have anywhere from 8 people to 16 or more. And we just bring the problems that we've been facing in those last couple of weeks and exciting discoveries and really fun facts to the fore. So if you would like to be a part of those transcriber coffee hours, email me, csmith@christchurchphila.org, and I'll put it in to the chat, and we'll be sure to get you on the invitation list.
And if anyone did miss the other 3 events, they're all very shortly going to be on the Christchurch website on the news and updates page.
On the
Thank
Philadelphia
you.
Congregation's website, that is.
You're right. My bad. Philadelphia Congregation's website. So you're welcome to view those at your leisure and enjoy them, because I even learned things during them. It was entertaining for me as well.
Carol, may I just take a moment to present one more example of how these transcriptions can be very, very useful. And I want to thank Bill Quigley and Libby Brown for teaching us so much about our own history at Christ Church. We've learned so much from their involvement in the records. Over the last 15 or 20 years, Christ Church has been computerizing its sacramental database of baptisms and burials and marriages. And that has gone into an electronic database that I have custody of. And it gives us a tremendous advantage that's only now being developed by all of us in transcribing the CLIR records. But looking ahead to what that will mean is an example that we're doing at Christ Church right now. There's a committee at Christ Church that now has been expanded to include St. Peter's, taking a look at the involvement of those two churches in slavery over the years, particularly in the 18th century. I've been asked to take a look at that database to see what I can find about the presence of sacraments that were administered to both free blacks and slaves. And Libby touched on this in her presentation a little bit. If I may share my screen, I want to show you something that I developed and have passed on to the people who are doing that investigation. Let me just take a look at this. And that is not it. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling around here, but I want to show you. There is a part of the results of a query about what slavery, what sacraments, what baptisms specifically were administered to slaves in the 18th and 19th centuries. Just by querying this electronic database, I turned up 475 cases in which slaves or free blacks were baptized at Christ Church and St. Peter's. We can't always tell which church they were baptized at because they were a common congregation in those days. But I'm able now to give to our Reconciliation Committee pointers to 475 original records that they can examine to see what those records contain and tell us about the involvement of Christ Church and St. Peter's in slavery in the 19th century. We did similar studies of the burials. There were very few burials, but also marriages. It turned up about 50 marriages throughout the 18th century. So by being able to search these records, which is what we're all working toward in transcribing all of the congregational records that are part of the CLIR project, once they are searchable, this is a kind of tool it's going to give researchers. It'll be a wonderful pointer into the original records, which of course is where the majority of the research is going to take place. So you're doing very, very valuable work. That's the whole message. Thank you so much.
I'm hoping to echo Alan's comments. Libby and Bill, thank you so much for your wonderful presentations this morning. It's just so interesting and so inspiring to hear how people use these records, and we are very grateful to you. And of course, we're very grateful to Beth and the Athenaeum for all their help with this project and for letting us reach out to all of you and tell you about it. And so thank you for joining us and being with us. And please stay in touch. We'd love to have you working on this.
Thank you all. And remember, if you have any questions, Carly provided her email. You can ask her. I think Alan, we've got his email, Carol. So we've got folks involved you can ask questions of. Join their bi-weekly coffee group to get help. And let us at the Athenaeum also know if you're working on something, because we would love to hear how you're making use of this workshop and getting engaged. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.